Welcome to our webinar today. We understand it's a beautiful day in Rochester, and we're pleased to have you joining us today for this Crisis Coach webinar. We're going to be discussing about your crisis manager's first crisis.
Bill, did we lose you there?
Well, no, you're here. I'm waiting for the slide to move.
Oh, okay. There you go.
We invite you to become our friend at Firestorm. Firestorm Solutions is our Facebook account. Twitter, we're known as Firestorm Soul, and our hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product must be read in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have the Rochester Business Alliance as our host and underwriter of this Crisis Coach webinar series. Chip, over to you for some introductory comments about the Rochester Business Alliance, please.
Well, thank you, Bill, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 10th session in the 2015 series of the Crisis Coach. And in case you didn't realize it, the very first session in the RBA partnership with Firestorm took place exactly 2 years ago on this date in 2013. The Rochester Business Alliance is, of course, pleased to move into the third year of our partnership with Firestorm and continue our year-old relationship with our friends at the Eastern Great Lakes Association of Contingency Planners. Together, we bring you, our members, this important 45-minute discussion by Jim Satterfield, one of the country's top crisis managers. Today, Jim will cover, as Bill has already said, when your company crisis is your crisis manager's first crisis. That's a mouthful. A look at real readiness. Now, I know from long experience, over 50 years now, that far too many people in charge freeze or panic in a crisis with no clue of what to do, or they often do the wrong things. At the same time, heroes come out of many of the most horrendous events. At Umpqua Community College, Chris Mintz, an Army veteran, charged the shooter to block a door and was seriously wounded in the process. On the Paris to Amsterdam train, Airman Spencer Stone and Guardsman Alex Coteros and their friend Anthony Sadler charged Aboud Al-Kazani to stop his attack. At Sandy Hook, multiple staff sprung into action to stop Adam Lanza. Principals John Hopspring and psychologist Mary Sherlock died. Most recently, an American Airlines co-pilot made an emergency landing in Syracuse with the pilot dead in the seat beside him. But the common thread in all of these cases was that they were all well trained to act in a crisis. They had a plan and they implemented it. Had it not been for their preparedness, many more people might have died. Certainly, heroes often come from the unlikeliest places, but they have a couple of things in common. They have good training and the courage to act that came from the training. Maybe you have people like them in your organization, but hoping that is not a valid plan. It's unconscionable that a large percentage of workplaces have no plan and no emergency skills. Today, you'll get some help to ensure you're ready. Now, here's Jim.
Well, thank you, Chip. It's always a pleasure to me to hear your insights and to talk about it. And before the webinar started today, Chip and Bill and I were just talking about the events of the past week with the hurricane and the flooding in South Carolina, the shootings in California, the airplane flights. Unfortunately, we are living in times where events sometimes drive us. And the idea of being able to make decisions and direct a team in a crisis, I think, is one that is on all of our desks continually. Our thanks also to the Association of Contingency Planners, the Eastern Great Lakes chapter, for underwriting this webinar series, Crisis Coach webinar series, and we're glad to continue that affiliation. And no, Chip, I didn't realize that today was the 2-year anniversary. We're starting the just to finish 10 years with Firestorm, in the market. And so as we look at all of the things that we've seen over those 10 years, I think today's topic certainly ties in appropriately. I'm Jim Satterfield. I'm president of Firestorm and one of the 3 founders. So when we think about a crisis, is it a danger or an opportunity? We've shared the quote out of JFK's book where that's a Chinese symbol combining those two. But our goal is always to transform this crisis into value. And I think that's the decision factor that we find ourselves in. And this is a turning point in a business when a crisis occurs, and the trend of everything that comes after will be seen at that point. What you find out initially in the crisis is wrong. Most every piece of information that you hear will be wrong as that comes in, and you're going to be forced, and your crisis manager will be forced to make decisions based upon wrong information. And we're going to talk a lot about that in just a few minutes, but we want to understand that it's not business as usual, it's business as unusual. And the consequences then will last for years. This is the turning point within the organization, with the clients, with the market, and how you will be seen and how you perform. Now, when we think about a crisis, there's a lot of attributes, and you see them listed here. And again, there's that inaccurate or wrong information, the loss of command and control. Never lose sight of that third bullet up, the fact that every crisis is a human crisis. It's people, and everyone responds differently, as Chip had pointed out, as we look at those events occur. The last one is the one that's the most startling. It comes to you as a surprise. Yes, we will have trained. Yes, we will have done a plan. But at that moment, it's a surprise. If someone comes running into your office to alert you of something, it's going to be an issue that you weren't expecting, and by its very nature. And I've said on several of our webinars that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5 and it was my birthday. When you look at a crisis and you look at the surprise that comes with it, it's certainly going to be a game changer within your organization. Now, I want to start to introduce some new concepts today in a variety of areas. And first is visibility, vulnerability. And that's going to change the perceptions of how you are as an organization. As you are elevated in a crisis, then everyone will look and see what were the decisions you made, what's the exposure around it. Look at the questions that are coming up now about the ship, should it have gone out with the hurricane building in the Atlantic. Look at the decisions that were made at the college and what occurred there and to come together. So when you find yourself in a crisis, the visibility will be escalated and the impact of your decisions and words become disproportionately large. We see this all the time in the political arena as those elements come together. So as you're doing your vulnerability and threat assessment or your hazard impact matrix, I'd like you to add visibility, vulnerability as a category and to think about it and how it would come and impact your business. So here's the first one of the definitions that we have listed here. It gives you a framework for that. Secondly, I would like you to think about the fact that you need to be able to see what's about to happen. One of the 5 common failures in a disaster or crisis is the failure to monitor all threats and risks. So the more that you have the ability to have an intelligence network, to know what's going to be happening, what are the reactions to the statements that you're making, how are your people doing, the better you will do in terms of managing that crisis. So as we think about it being your crisis manager's first crisis, understand that there's this visibility, vulnerability, both from the exposure from the actions and deeds you do, and then for the inability to see what's going to happen. Now, one of the things that is critical in all of this is to make sure that that crisis manager has the information they need. Chip did a good summary saying this is where the planning and training and exercises become so very important. So the crisis concepts here, this is the environment that you're placing that crisis manager in. Something has occurred. Senior leadership has limited or potentially wrong information. And I can't underscore it enough to talk about the fact that the information that you get initially in the crisis will be wrong. And in some cases, you will need your crisis manager to move beyond what they're being told and to look at other facts to make those decisions. There will be confusion on the facts that are out there, and you'll get different reports from different individuals, and that's going to place that crisis manager under even greater stress. So what do you do now? What are you going to monitor? What are you going to say? So we're going to think a lot about actions and words as we continue to talk about this environment that we find ourselves in. You clearly are going to be under scrutiny from outside, and the brand and reputation will have a significant impact, and potentially new liabilities that can come into your company. Now, historically, we had a golden hour in a crisis. You could go and talk to your PR firm, to your legal, to others to determine what you were going to act, and then it moved down to golden minutes, and now it's golden seconds. In this world of social media, people are going to be commenting on it about what's happening and what's being said or not said. So your report card is being formed on social media throughout the crisis, and getting that knowledge back to the crisis manager will become critical to understand what's happening and what's occurring. Now, if you've selected someone that's gone through crises before, had managed decisions, they'll have a big advantage. They will have seen the movie before. They'll understand what's going to happen. And when you think about it, how do you know what you don't know? And we've used variations of this slide in several of our presentations, and I think it's certainly germane here today. You know what you know. You've got that experience. You've worked with a company for a period of time. You have that understanding. And in some cases, you know what you don't know. You haven't had the report back from a particular area. But if you look at that orange or red big hunk of that circle, you see that what you don't know what you don't know. And that in a crisis becomes the driving force. And so we continually, all of our actions, all of our plans are to reduce that amount of the unknown so that you can plan and act appropriately. If you had full knowledge, then managing the crisis becomes significantly easier. But that vast amount of information that's outside of your immediate span and control is going to be a driving factor. So where do you start? We've talked about this as our crisis manager's first crisis. And there's just a lot of ways that we can go, and it's going to continually put us in circles in some cases. But look at the two comments to the left and the right of the picture. A crisis is not business as usual. A crisis is business as unusual. And that's what you need to understand, and understand that there's not a perfect answer in every one of these scenarios. We're going to need to choose between bad choice 1 and bad choice 2. Select the one you want to do. We were working with a client just this week in a situation where they were forced to make a choice between two bad alternatives. That's what a crisis manager must do. They must become decisive and lead their team to carry forward, because it's not a normal business environment. There's not a perfect choice. By definition, it's a crisis, and all choices will be suboptimal. And explaining that to your team, to your senior leadership, to your board, will become extremely important. So let's think a little bit more about this. How do we know if we got the right person? This is our crisis manager's first crisis. Do we think that they can handle this particular area? So look at the kinds of things that we're looking for in that crisis manager. Somebody that's going to be decisive. Can they take the information and say, okay, we're going to do this, or I need you to do that. They have to have excellent communication skills, because we have no margin to have the wrong action or interpretation taken in. They have to be perceived within your organization with the authority to act. Because if they give a direction and somebody says, well, we need to go back to Frank and find out if we're going to do that, that's not going to be giving them any advantage or opportunity there. And they need to be able to maintain relationships with everyone on their team and carry it forward. Obviously, they have to be a leader. We always say that every crisis needs a general. Do you see the crisis manager you've selected, and have you empowered that crisis manager with the authority to be the general? Can they be perceived that way by everyone that's involved? They've got to be at ease at making decisions. They have to be knowledgeable about your company, the emergency, the dynamics. Obviously, there's some type of a subject matter expert, or you wouldn't have selected them for that area. And then resourceful. If plan A and B and C don't work, They have to be able to figure out what are plans D, E, and F. This is a point where the focus will be clearly on them throughout it. So when you think about the experience, the roles and responsibilities, making decisions is the one that becomes completely the dominant force here. These are all the types of things that crisis manager is going to be forced to do as this process starts to escalate throughout the organization, and someone that's going to need to be comfortable in dealing with the senior leadership within your organization and the board. Now, we generally recommend that the CEO not be the crisis manager, not be the initial spokesperson for the organization, because they'll have other responsibilities to carry forward, but at some point they will need to come forward and be seen and heard. So there's a lot of actions here that we're looking for, again, in this person. Now, let's place this crisis in context. There are 5 stages of escalation in a crisis. Pre-action is all the planning, what you're doing right now. What training do we need? What are the characteristics of the crisis manager? How do we establish those elements? And the event occurs, and then we move into onset. How are we communicating, letting people know that it's there? We're focusing on life and safety. And then our emergency response plan, the lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, and evacuator coming in. While that's going on, we're doing a high-level impact assessment. How bad is this? What does this mean to us? And then, if necessary, we are declaring a crisis. Our crisis manager steps in, taking a look at our crisis management plan, where we've got detailed actions that they will oversee in all of our critical departments to respond to that. And then as that starts to wind down and the crisis comes to more control, then we're implementing the business continuity program and the individual business continuity plans in each department. The post is going to be extremely important, because after every event, we want to do a hot wash. What worked well? What didn't work well? What did you want to know that you didn't? What changes do we need to make in our plans? So the crisis manager functions in this environment and carries through with all of the actions that we need to have. Now, I want to delve a little bit more into the crisis with a couple of dimensions, and then we're going to start to give you the questions and the actions that you need to take and that crisis manager needs to focus on. So if we think about a crisis, there's a level of complexity that starts to come in and will determine it. And you've heard us talk a lot about this, particularly around the business crisis risk area, but it's true in any type of a crisis environment. The easier ones to handle are ones that are targeted. It's easily identifiable. It only becomes more complex if we don't do a good job in managing it, and mitigating it is more straightforward. Now, we didn't say it wasn't bad. It could be a tornado. It could be a hurricane. We could clearly understand those events. It could even be the workplace violence or the active shooter. It's targeted. We know what it is. It only has, in essence, that variable from that particular exposure that you're going to handle. As that becomes more complex, then we've got many attributes. Multiple things are happening at the same time, and they can be competing. We could have a data breach going on while this is occurring. We could have an explosion that was happening. We could have other things that were carrying on, and so it's going to take a much more sophisticated response, and there's pressure to get it right, because obviously if this is a complex crisis, this is a sufficient event that could bring our company or organization down. If a new crisis manager, hopefully they've participated and been a part of a team, at least in a targeted area, but if you bring them in to a multivariable, complex crisis with many moving parts, they're going to find that a great challenge. If we also think about the crisis, what's the time to react? How quickly can we act? And obviously, it's always going to be urgent in any crisis, but we're focused on the event, but the whole organization is not consumed. If we had a problem in a remote office, well, it's not going to shut down our corporation. It's going to impact only that particular one. So the more targeted and the more focused the event is, the easier it will be to manage that particular crisis. And then we're able to carry on other functions without derailing the organization. To the extent that it's an extreme urgency, the organization is consumed by the event, then we're in a different area. We've got to talk about business processes and how we start to mitigate it and how we go together. If you think about if you were a company headquartered in South Carolina today with failing dams and 2 feet of water and over $1 billion estimated in damages, by the way, we anticipate that number will be closer to 2 or 3 billion by the time it's involved. It becomes an all-consuming activity. So think about the crisis both in terms of its level of complexity and the time to react, and that will give you an indicator of how much support you need to give to this first-time crisis manager. So here's your cheat sheet. If you're working with this crisis manager, we want to identify the why of any actions or communications. Why are we going to do that? And until you've asked that question 5 times, and we'll come back to you with that, you do not want to communicate with anyone. So the first thing that that crisis manager must do is to discuss what will happen next within the organization, within the crisis that's in front of them. Develop a plan, a high-level view of the plan or process or strategy that you're going to try to implement, and then perform. Identify what you need to do and say. That's always the questions that people will ask. What is it that we're to do? What is it that we're to say? The quick test to slow this down, and you've heard a lot of times if we talk about sports analogies where a quarterback says, well, I've gotten to the point now where the action has slowed down. I can see things develop, so I'll know that if they're doing this, I should do that. The same thing is true of a crisis manager. They need to be able to get this quick test to understand what is it that they know, what is it that they're concerned about, what's their strategy or plan, what are they going to monitor, and the reason the monitor is here, and that's one of the absolutely most critical areas, is we've already told you that most everything you find out is going to be wrong, and so you're having to make decisions based upon wrong information. So you want to verify continually what is it that you know and adjust your strategy and actions and words according to. But similarly, because everything is going to be wrong, you want to be very minimalistic on your communications. So if you're looking at this, what are you going to communicate? How are you going to communicate it? Who are you going to communicate it to? And more importantly, why? We would encourage you always, if you have stakeholders, if you have the need to communicate with them, you communicate with them directly. You do not go through the media. The media will have their own spin, their own objective, and their own agenda associated with it. And early in the crisis, particularly communications need to be minimal, because if you know that the facts are initially wrong, how those communications will change will be clearly seen and need to be understood. So now we're trying to help our first-time crisis manager. We've given them some kind of a quick test here to look at and focus, help them to think about the predict, the plan, and the perform. What questions should they be focused on at this point in time? Well, these crisis strategy questions come up fairly clearly. What's occurred? What's known? What's going to happen next? What are you concerned about? What's the plan? What is the monitoring plan? What are the metrics? How are we going to be evaluated here? What are our key messages? Who's the spokesperson? What training have they had? What are the threats, risks, and vulnerabilities? Who are the internal and external parties? Who's involved internally within our organization? Who's involved externally? Are we talking about people living in the community where we're located? Are we talking about our customers? Are we talking about our clients' employees? Are we talking about our employees? How do all of those areas come together? And then what are their agendas? Is somebody going to use this as a particular weapon in this particular area? If you're a union organization, will the union be using this crisis as a part of their demands and carrying and using it that forward? We would recommend that if you bring a crisis manager in, you bring that external crisis manager to assist. By the way, I'm certainly glad to recommend an excellent firm by the name of Firestorm. That would be lost if I hadn't said that. But have them come in being retained by the general counsel or your outside legal firm. The idea is that many things you learn in a crisis, we would like to establish an attorney-client privilege here early in the process. And then what is the records retention policy to use during and after the crisis, because in many of these cases there will be litigation. So planning on what was written down, what did you know, when did you know it, how did this get communicated will become very critical. And so these are the types of questions that need to be in that crisis manager's mind. And this would be a great training tool to start to ask them about before the event and with your crisis team in starting to focus, because these are the issues that you're going to have to use as you activate the plans that you're in place, that you have in place. And Chip did a great job of telling you you need plans. You need to train your people. You need to be prepared. So what are the actions? So great, we got questions. What are the actions? Well, we need to establish what happened. We need to identify the information contacts. Who can we go back to get more information, recognizing that it's incomplete? What is the risk and vulnerability that we're about to face? How are we going to monitor social media? Today the term is merged media, and that's the combination of social and traditional media, and that's where designing your intelligence network. If you don't have an intelligence network beforehand, you clearly must have one in the crisis. Now, how can the general run a battle if he doesn't know what the enemy is doing, which direction they're moving, and what the actions are that they're trying to take? Well, if you're in a crisis, how are your people responding? Are they doing what you need to do? What are your clients saying? What is happening in the market? There are going to be people that support you, and there are going to be people that are detractors. Identifying those will determine parts of our strategy. We worked with a client a couple of weeks ago where there was an individual who was posting threats against the organization in a particular office. Identifying who that individual was became a key security element. You're going to have to conduct your own investigation. If there was a violence event, clearly the police and the authorities will do that. If there was some other compliance issue, the regulators are going to do it. But you need to be able to determine what really did we do, what did we do right, what did we do wrong, identify all the stakeholders here, create our initial messages, monitor. And the monitor's on here a couple of times because you cannot monitor enough in these particular areas, and that's going to give your first-time crisis manager the edge. You've got to make sure your people are trained. If they're not trained, we've got to train them at that point. That can even be done virtually. It doesn't have to have it be done on the site. I've seen that done effectively so that you at least understand. If this is a mega event, then you need to be able to have a call center to fill the calls that are coming in from family members who want to know or clients to know about this. So this could be a product recall, it could be a data breach, it could be a violence episode. People will want to know if you need help in establishing a call center, and there is an advantage to having an external relationship established in advance, because then it's not your people that are on the phone talking to your people. It's someone that can have the empathy without being directly involved. We can help you establish and stand up that call center in about 45 minutes. If you've got specific communications, I would recommend that you've trained your people that, well, we're going to give updates on our website, or we're going to give updates on our Facebook account. How will that work? Many of the times in a crisis, the website becomes so overloaded, it's not ready to handle the overwhelming level of messages. Now, hopefully you have a crisis communications plan and message maps, but as new information comes in, there will be new questions that will have to be asked. You'll need to update those. And then identify when will the media come back up. Obviously, if it was a violence episode, you could think about at the arrest or death of the person causing it. If they were arrested at the arraignment, at the bond hearing, at the trial, if you're dealing with other events, there will be similar triggers that you can clearly see in the media and determine what your strategy would be. Firestorm supports a why media strategy. Until you can answer that question 5 times, you shouldn't be talking to the media. And that will create your second crisis when you do. Update your project calls. You want to have your team knowing this is where we are and how it's going to advance. We generally, every time you do a communications, you want internally to your crisis team, let them know when the next update will be coming in. And if we have to go on site, who's going to go and who's going to be there? So those are all actions as we think about steps that have to be taken. So we've given you the questions. Here are the actions. So well, should we be talking? Why? If you're explaining, you're losing. We do not want to talk about the actual event that occurred initially. If it was an act of violence or a fire or an explosion, let the police or the fire department talk about it. They're going to talk about the problem. You're going to talk about the solution. And you've heard us say in multiple webinars that if you're starting this for the very first time, here are 3 messages to give your crisis manager and your spokesperson. The first message is that you'll not be defined by the event. Whatever this terrible thing is that's occurred, it's not what your company is about. It's not who you are. And the second message is that you'll invent the future. This will be the safest place to work. This will be, here are the actions that we're putting into place, and to talk about it. You want to talk about the future. And then the third message is that you want to embrace the families. It's about people. Remember that statement we made at the very beginning of the webinar today? Every crisis is a human crisis. So you want to talk about your hearts go out, and here's what you're doing. Now, if you're thinking about communications, we're going to give you some structure to be able to handle that. First, there are 3 C's of crisis communication: coordination, talking about the crisis, and compliance. Anytime you're doing communications in a crisis environment, you're in one of these 3 categories, and that will determine who we send the message to and what the message covers. Coordination is generally internally to direct the activities to deal with it, and I put in cyber breach here to give you an example of what it could be, but in any response and recovery. Second, it could be more public, talking about the crisis itself, the potential impacts on the brand and reputation. And then finally, compliance. They meet the communications responsibilities related to notification of parties. This could be a product recall, or I left cyber in here to give you an idea, because if somebody's personal information, whether it's the PII, personally identifiable information, or PHI, personal health information, was taken, so that you're being able to mitigate those impacts. So as you're thinking about your communications, place them in one of these 3 buckets. Are you communicating to coordinate? Are you communicating to deal with the crisis? Or are you communicating from a compliance standpoint? That will help direct it. So as we think then about crisis communications, we come back to that same predict, plan, perform. Predict who is the audience and what are their concerns. Your message has to be addressed specifically to that audience and their concerns. Tailor the message, the messenger, and the media. And that media could be media or medium. You're going to send a text message. You're going to get on a phone call. If there was an event, we do a lot of work in a variety of areas. Let's put us in a camp or a school environment. Well, you'd want to talk to the parents of those children if there had been a problem, a fire or a lightning strike or something else. And we would recommend you get on the phone and give them a direct call, because it's going to be better for them to hear from you than to be reading something somewhere else. And you format the message to the stakeholder. You want to make sure that you're speaking in a format that's appropriate to them and how we would carry that forward. And then focus on the 3 key messages. People can't understand 50 things. If you're communicating with them, boil it down to here's the first key message, here's the second, and here's the third. That becomes a much more manageable approach, and particularly for your new crisis manager, that they're not having to deal with trying to remember 50 things at that point. So let's talk about what does all this mean. If this happens, you're looking for as much warning as you can get. You need to know before now. And so it's not a matter in many of these cases of an if, but really a when, because there will be problems that will occur, and you'll have a need to take action. And it's about consequence management more so than crisis management, because that's how you're going to ultimately be measured, is how did the consequences come out. And so as we think about this, it's this struggle between strategic and tactical. Tactical would be, here's a couple of things that we need to do. The standard protocol, lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, and evacuate. Those are all tactical things. But what is it going to mean to us strategically? What are the consequences within our organization? And then we start to think about this as a business crisis risk. There is a crisis that's occurring within our organization. And that's a risk factor, going back to that vulnerability risk assessment or the hazard impact, that as we focus on it, and this was the discussion that we had earlier today about the targeted and complex, about the urgency and the time to act. You've got to create an intelligence network. If you had any warning, if you could have found out that there was a behavior of concern or there was a particular issue that you needed to be aware of, that time gives you a chance to put as much in place as you can before it becomes critical. And finally, having instant access tools. We're very fortunate today that the technology has advanced to such a level that you can actually put the business plan, the emergency plan, or the crisis management plan, or the recovery plan onto a smartphone, and it would be in the palm of the hand of the people that need to have it. That becomes so important. So this instant access tool, that's what the big "it" is on the screen, becomes so very, very critical. Now, you don't want to give everybody every plan on that phone, but clearly every employee could have the emergency plan about what they're to do and what you would expect them to carry forward. Individual departments might have access to the checklist that they need to do in response to a problem or an issue or a crisis, or their response plan or their recovery plan included within it. The crisis management team would also have access to the checklist to make sure that they were done, or how they would do the impact assessment and understand it. Putting those plans in the palm of someone's hand is a real game changer here and a great way to help that new crisis manager. So when does everybody want to know? Before now. No one wants to get a phone call from their boss telling them something that, why didn't I know about this, or why didn't you tell me about it? It becomes extremely critical. So if you want a seat at the table, then you're going to need to get that chair turned up right and start focusing on the fact that this is strategic, not tactical, and focused on what the measurement would be in. So we're facing challenges above. So I got a new crisis manager. What do I work on first? Now, this showing an urgency and importance chart shows us that we really need to be focused on that red box there. Those things that are both urgent and important, that's stuff that we do now. Everything else is not now. So before now, before anything else, we look at to determine, is this something that's urgent and important? If it's important but not urgent, we're not going to be worried about it during a crisis. That's going to slow us down. Even if it's important but not urgent, we're not going to be focused there. It could be urgent, but if it's not important, then let it sit. Focus and ask this question, is it urgent and is it important? That's where the actions will happen. Now, I showed you the 5 stages earlier, and what this slide does is breaks that down into the actions that crisis manager is going to have to focus on making sure are in place. And don't underestimate the role that the new crisis manager will play in pre-action. That's where those relationships get built. That's where those foundations are. That's where the supplies are established, and the training and the exercise and testing. Look at the questions along the bottom of the page. There will be lots of questions in each of those areas to come back, and you'll see specific actions that need to be taken and messages that come together. Now, we talked a little bit about the intelligence network, and the key element here is knowing before now. If you look at all of those business crisis risks that are listed in the background, you have to go through and say, how would I know if I was having that problem? What does that mean for me to come together? And having that intelligence network will empower you and give you the time when you need it the most. So you've got to then measure how you did. This is a maturity model that Firestorm has developed that lets you focus on the decision process, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision making, and communications effectiveness. The goal is obviously to move the culture within your firm up to that stage 4, where it's strategic, and you'll look at the descriptors in each one of those areas. Generally, when we come into a crisis in an organization, we find they're mostly in a category 1 or 2 or somewhere in between. As you have the luxury of time to prepare, you'll be able to improve your performance. This is also a useful tool as you do your hot watch, your after-action review, to identify the actions that should have been done, the decisions that should have been in place in each of those areas. So why do we do all this? Because when minutes matter, seconds count. That first-time crisis manager is going to be placed in a completely different scenario. The events are going to be happening rapidly, and the ability to come through and make those decisions in direct becomes the measuring stick, not only of that new crisis manager, but your entire firm. So predict, plan, perform. Predict what the vulnerabilities and threats are. What's going to be happening next? What's its impact? How do we monitor it? What's the trigger for the action? What's our plan, our strategies, our policies and procedures? And then we have to perform. And we have to continually monitor, because we're going to need to adjust this on the fly as we go forward. So do you want to know what's going to happen tomorrow? Can you afford not to? Do you want to know how that crisis manager is going to do in a crisis? Plan an exercise. There are 2 ways to test a plan. Wait for a crisis, or to have a test exercise in advance and see the leadership factors here. See how the team interacts. Now, we did a virtual crisis exercise in August. We now are announcing a new crisis exercise. This one will be cyber. So there'll be a cyber breach exercise. You can participate with your team. It'll be first held on the 8th, and there'll be a second one on the 14th. It's the same exercise, but at a request from some of the people who attended the last, this gives you 2 days that you would select the one that's best for you and your team. You also had requested advance notice, so consider this your advance notice that coming up on December the 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern or December the 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be doing a 90-minute virtual test exercise related to cyber breach. You want to make sure your plan's aligned to best practices. That's going to be the best support you can give this new crisis manager. Design your own intelligence network. If you need assistance, just ask. Create an instant access tool. Get that plan on those smart devices, and schedule training. So our thanks today to the Rochester Business Alliance and the Eastern Great Lakes chapter of the Association of Contingency Planners. Chip, do you have any last words today before we tell people how they can get the brief?
Sure, Jim, thanks. I think back to the 2 years of fantastic stuff that you've given us, great information, great ideas, great approaches. The thing that falls apart, though, with all of this is if you don't have top management on board, if they haven't bought in. And it suggests to me that for a lot of our participants in this program, and a lot of the people that I deal with here locally, that what they need to do is go back to their risk assessment and paint a picture for their organization and for their top management of what if this happens, if this risk that we've determined is there actually takes place, how bad is it going to be, and how do we deal with that? That, I think, can help you get them on board, and then you can proceed with all this training that we've had today and going forward. So, Jim, as always, thanks. It generates, I think, some great thoughts and great ideas, and hopefully our participants have made lots of notes, and they're off and running.
Well, I hope so, and our hope is that they won't need this. Unfortunately, history hasn't been kind and shows that we do. There will be a brief about today's webinar, and you can go to the Firestorm website and download the brief. It should be up in the next couple of days so that you have that you can share with others. So I would encourage you to go there, find it, click on the brief from today's or any of the other webinars to get that information. If you've got questions, you can go to our website at firestorm.com or send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com. or give us a call at 800-321-2219. Unfortunately, we're all going to be forced to face a crisis at some point. We don't know how we're going to react, and what we've seen is that in some cases people freeze, in other cases they act. What you need to do is to test your plan, support that crisis manager, and recognize that they have one of the most difficult jobs. Anybody can make a choice between here's a great choice and here's a bad choice. In a crisis, the majority of the time, you're choosing between two bad choices. The only way to resolve that is to follow, predict, plan, perform. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week, and we'll look forward to talking with you again next month. Goodbye.